If you ever check into a roadside motel and smell copper, don't look at the bed. Look at the ceiling, because by the time it starts dripping on you, it's already too late. I should have just slept in my truck. It was 2:30 a.m. somewhere off Interstate 40 in New Mexico. The rain was coming down so hard I couldn't see 5 feet in front of my hood. My eyes were burning, blurring from 14 straight hours of driving. Then, out of the blackness, that neon sign appeared like a dying star. The Desert Oasis Motel. Half the letters were burnt out. It just read, "The Die Oasis." I should have taken it as a sign. The guy at the front desk didn't even look up from his tiny black and white TV. He just slid a rusted brass key across the counter. Room 108. The air inside the room hit me like a wall of damp wool. It smelled like old cigarettes, cheap bleach, and something else. Something sweet and metallic. I threw my duffel bag on the floor and collapsed onto the bed, too exhausted to care about the cigarette burns in the comforter. I closed my eyes, desperate for sleep. Tap, tap, tap. I groaned, pulling the pillow over my ears. I thought it was just the bathroom faucet. I tried to ignore it, but the sound wasn't coming from the bathroom. It was coming from right above me. Tap, tap. Then, something cold and wet hit the center of my forehead. I wiped it away with the back of my hand, thinking the roof was leaking from the storm. I turned on the bedside lamp. The weak yellow bulb flickered to life. I looked at my hand. It wasn't rainwater. It was thick, dark red. My heart did a violent flip in my chest. I looked up at the ceiling. Right above my bed, the water-damaged drywall was sagging, forming a heavy, bloated bubble. And right in the center of that bubble, a dark crimson stain was spreading. Tap. Another drop fell, landing right on my lip. It tasted like pennies. It was blood. "Hey! Anyone up there?" I yelled at the ceiling, my voice shaking. No answer. Just the heavy thud of the rain outside. There shouldn't have been anyone up there. The Desert Oasis was a single-story motel. There was no second floor, just a crawl space and a flat gravel roof. I stood up on the bed, my knees trembling. I needed to see what it was. Maybe an animal had crawled up there and died? Yeah, that's what I told myself. Just a dead deer or a coyote. I pushed aside the ceiling tile right next to the stain. The stench that hit my face made me gag. It was the smell of a butcher shop left out in the summer sun. I shone my phone's flashlight into the dark, narrow crawl space. Dust motes danced in the beam of light. I swept the light around. Old insulation, rusted pipes. And then, the beam hit a pair of boots, work boots, covered in dried mud. I froze. I couldn't breathe. The boots were attached to legs. Drag marks were visible in the thick dust of the crawl space, leading deeper into the dark. I moved the light up. There was a man lying on his stomach. His clothes were shredded, and his back was scooped out, completely hollowed out, exposing white ribs. That's where the blood was coming from. It was pooling under him and soaking through the drywall. My breath hitched. I went to climb down, but then the flashlight beam caught something else. Further back in the crawl space, crouched in the shadows where the roof met the wall, there was something else. It wasn't human. It was pale, impossibly thin, with limbs that were too long, bent at unnatural angles like a spider. It was hunched over the man's head. And as my flashlight hit its face, it stopped eating. It turned its head all the way around, 180 degrees, It had no eyes, just milky, scarred skin where its eyes should have been. But it knew I was looking at it. Its jaw dropped open, stretching wider than any human mouth could, revealing rows of needle-thin black teeth. It let out a sound. It wasn't a roar. It was a wet, clicking whisper. And then it mimicked a voice, a perfect, recording-like human voice. "Room 108 is occupied," it whispered. It was the voice of the motel clerk from the front desk. The creature suddenly lunged forward, scrambling across the rafters on all fours with terrifying speed. I fell backward off the bed, crashing hard onto the linoleum floor. My phone flew out of my hand, the flashlight beam spinning wildly across the room. Upstairs, the ceiling tiles began to crack and shatter. Thud, thud, thud. The thing was tearing through the ceiling, dropping down into my room. I didn't look back. I scrambled on my hands and knees toward the door, threw the deadbolt open, and burst out into the pouring rain. I didn't grab my keys, my bag, nothing. I just ran. I ran down the dark highway in my socks, the rain blinding me, until a semi-truck finally pulled over to save me. The police went back to that motel the next morning. They found the body in the crawl space. It was the real motel clerk. He'd been dead for days. But they never found the thing that was feeding on him. And when I look at the police report, there's one detail they can't explain. The keys to every single room were found inside room 108, neatly arranged in a circle around the hole in the ceiling. When you're alone in a sketchy motel room, the peephole on the door is supposed to keep the outside world out. But what do you do when you look through it and see someone looking back? I'm an auditor, which means I spend about 200 nights a year in cheap motels. You get used to the stains, the weird noises, the sketchy characters loitering in the parking lot. You learn to lock the deadbolt, slide the security chain, and mind your own business. But the Pinecrest Motel in upstate New York was different. It felt heavy, like the air itself was tired of existing. I got into room 214 around midnight. It was a standard depressing layout. 2 double beds, a bolted down TV, and a heavy wooden door with a brass peephole. I checked the locks, like I always do. The deadbolt clicked into place. The chain was secure. I felt safe. I fell asleep around 1 a.m. I woke up at 3:14 a.m. Exactly. My eyes just snapped open. The room was pitch black except for the green glow of the digital alarm clock. I listened. The room was dead silent, but I felt this overwhelming sensation of being watched. You know that prickle on the back of your neck? It was screaming at me. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic scraping sound. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was coming from the front door. I crept out of bed, keeping my footsteps silent on the rough carpet. I approached the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. I thought maybe it was a drunk guest trying their key in the wrong door. Or worse, a burglar trying to pick the lock. The scraping stopped right as I reached the door. I held my breath and leaned in close. I placed my eye against the cold brass of the peephole to look out into the exterior walkway. All I saw was blackness, just solid, deep black. I frowned. The walkway outside was supposed to be lit by bright floodlights. I thought maybe a moth was sitting on the outside of the glass, or someone had put a piece of tape over it as a prank. I stood there for a second, wondering what to do. Then the blackness moved. The blackness shifted, and a sliver of light cut through the peephole. I realized with a jolt of pure horror what I was actually looking at. It wasn't tape. It wasn't a bug. It was an eye. Someone was standing on the other side of the door, pressed entirely flat against the wood, looking in through the peephole at the exact same time I was looking out. The blackness I saw was their pupil. I stumbled backward, letting out a sharp gasp. My breath was ragged. "Who's there?" I shouted. "I have a gun! Get away from the door!" I didn't have a gun. I had a laptop charger and a pen. No one answered. No footsteps running away down the concrete walkway. Just silence. I stared at the door, waiting for the doorknob to jiggle. It didn't. Minutes ticked by. 10 minutes, 20 minutes. My legs were shaking from standing in the dark. I had to know if they were still there. I crept back to the door. I pressed my eye to the peephole again. The eye was gone. Now I could see the empty, well-lit concrete walkway outside. The floodlights were glaring. No one was there. I let out a massive sigh of relief. I wiped the cold sweat from my forehead. I turned around to walk back to the bed, intending to grab my phone and call the front desk. That's when I saw it. The green glow of the alarm clock illuminated the room just enough for me to notice something on the floor, right beneath the door. The security chain wasn't hanging down, it was stretched tight. And the deadbolt, the thumb turn on the inside of the room, was turned to the unlocked position. My blood turned to ice. I looked at the peephole again. The glass wasn't curved outward toward the hallway. It was curved inward toward the room. The peephole had been installed backward. Whoever was standing out there wasn't looking through a peephole into a dark room. They had been using a flashlight from the outside, looking through a wide-angle lens straight at me. And then I heard it. A soft, wet breathing sound. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside the closet, right next to my bed. The door didn't unlock from the outside. They had unlocked it from the inside before I ever even checked in. They just waited for me to go to sleep. I didn't even grab my shoes. I threw myself at the door, yanked it open, and screamed at the top of my lungs as I sprinted into the parking lot. I never went back for my stuff. I left my laptop, my clothes, my life in that room. Because when the police searched that closet the next morning, they found a sleeping bag, a camera, and a collection of Polaroids. Every single photograph was of a different guest, sleeping in that exact bed, taken from the slats of the closet door. And on the back of the last empty photo frame, written in black marker, was my name. If you hear the wheels of a housekeeping cart squeaking down the motel hallway at 4 a.m., do not open your door to ask for towels. Because the thing pushing that cart isn't trying to clean your room, it's trying to clean you out. That's the sound that woke me up at the Travelers Inn, just off the highway in Ohio. A miserable, run-down place where the walls were paper-thin and the carpets felt sticky, even if you wore shoes. It was 3:45 a.m. I had an early flight to catch, but this noise was drilling straight into my skull. Squeak, squeak, clunk. I rolled over, glaring at the space beneath my door. I could see the shadow of a large, bulky cart passing slowly by. It stopped right outside my room, room 14. "Housekeeping," a voice called out. It was a woman's voice, but it sounded wrong. The cadence was completely flat, monotone, like a text-to-speech robot trying to sound polite. "Go away," I yelled, throwing my pillow over my head. "It's 4 in the morning. Come back later." There was a long pause, then the heavy metallic thud of the cart shifting outside. "Fresh linens," the voice said again. Identical tone, identical pitch. It sounded like a recording being played back through a broken speaker. "I don't want any damn linens," I snapped, sitting up. The doorknob suddenly began to twist. It jiggled aggressively back and forth. Thank God I had locked the deadbolt. The door rattled against its frame but held fast. "Hey, stop that! I'm calling the cops!" I yelled, pulling my phone out. No service, of course. 0 bars. The jiggling stopped. "Room service," the voice said from right against the wood. "Time to clean." I walked over to the window, pulling the heavy, faded curtain back just an inch to look out onto the walkway. The housekeeping cart was there. It was piled high with gray stained sheets and old towels. But what caught my attention was what was dripping from the bottom shelf of the cart. A thick, black fluid was pooling on the concrete, sizzling slightly as it touched the cold air. Then I looked at the maid pushing the cart. She was wearing a standard blue uniform, but her posture was entirely deformed. Her spine was bent backward at a horrible angle, making her head tilt up toward the sky. She wasn't looking at my door. Her eyes were wide open, completely vacant, staring blankly at the ceiling of the walkway. Her skin was a sickly, bruised blue-gray color, tight against her skull. She wasn't holding the cart handle. Her hands were zip-tied to it. Something else was behind her. Hidden behind the massive pile of dirty linens, a shadow was looming. It was massive, bulky, and covered in a dirty leather apron. I couldn't see its face, but I could see its arms. They were massive, hairy, and ended in thick, calloused hands that were gripping the maid's shoulders, forcing her dead body forward like a twisted puppet. The giant shadow leaned down, pressing its face against the back of the dead woman's neck. And then, the dead woman's mouth moved again. "Housekeeping," her corpse chirped, the voice vibrating out of her throat, powered entirely by the creature hiding behind her. "Let us in." I stumbled back, dropping the curtain. They knew I was watching. A massive weight threw itself against the door. The wooden frame groaned. The deadbolt bent. Boom! Another hit. The wood began to splinter. The creature behind the cart was using its sheer, monstrous size to break the door down, using the dead maid's body as a battering ram. I panicked. There was no back exit. The only window was the one next to the door. Boom! The door gave way. The top hinge snapped with a loud metallic crack. A giant, pale, scarred hand reached through the gap, groping blindly for the lock on the inside. The fingers were long, stained with grease and dried blood, scraping against the wood. I didn't think. I grabbed the heavy, old-school cathode ray tube TV from the desk, hoisted it over my head with a burst of pure adrenaline, and hurled it straight through the front window. The glass exploded outward. Without hesitating, I dove head first through the broken window frame, glass slicing through my shirt and arms. I hit the concrete walkway, rolled and scrambled to my feet. I looked back for a fraction of a second. The door was completely broken off its hinges. The massive shadow in the leather apron was standing over the shattered TV. It had no face, just a mass of scar tissue and a jagged, vertical slit for a mouth. It held the dead maid by her hair, lifting her up like a doll. It looked at me, and from the slit in its face, It let out a deafening, metallic screech that sounded like a train braking on rusted tracks. I ran. I ran to my car, started the engine, and slammed on the gas, peeling out of the gravel parking lot so fast my tires smoked. I drove until the sun came up. When I finally found a state trooper and told him what happened, they raided the Travelers Inn. They found the motel completely abandoned. The manager, the guests, everyone was gone, except for the basement. In the basement, they found 32 housekeeping carts. Each one was loaded with clean sheets, and underneath those sheets were the neatly folded clothes and belongings of every guest who had checked into that motel for the last 10 years. I still travel for work, but now I never stay in motels. And if I'm in a hotel and I hear a wheel squeaking in the hallway late at night, I pack my bags and I leave immediately.